Welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey, it's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show, my friend. Thank you for being here, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. We do have a slew of destination episodes coming your way, and I thought for this week we would pull one out of the archives on Tibet. This one features an interview with Robert Kelly. He was actually the co-author of 2 editions of Lonely Planet's Tibet Guide, and he even brought some audio to this episode from Tibet that really takes you there. And I thought, well, this would be a fun one to share. And destinations like Tibet, you want to get there sooner than later, as these destinations are constantly evolving and changing and becoming more touristed, I guess I would say. I thought it would be a great time to pull this one out and to give you a taste of Tibet today. So please enjoy, stick around. I will leave you with a quote on the back end, of course, to tie up this one. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter over at zerototravel.com/newsletter. It is free and it is for you. It goes out once a week. So thanks for listening and please enjoy the interview. My guest today has co-authored 2 editions of Lonely Planet's Tibet Guide, including the most recent. He's also the creator of a new podcast called Travel Tape, Stories from the Other Side of the Travel Guide. The show consists of deeply researched content and audio from on the ground, bringing to life tales, histories, legends, interviews, and curiosities from around the world. You're going to hear some of the sounds of Tibet today from that podcast. You're also going to learn more about this destination. And we're going to talk about what it's like to be a guidebook author, I think, as well. A little bit long-term travel and just a ton of other stuff. I'm really thrilled to have him here. Robert Kelly, welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jason. I'm really excited to be here too.
Finally, we've been trading emails, we've been chatting a bit, and it's high time we shared some of your knowledge and wisdom. And I thought a good place to start would be Tibet, given your expertise as a guidebook author. How many times have you been to Tibet, and how long have you spent in the country?
I've been quite a few times. I mean, I've been there to do the research for the guides within the TAR. That's what they call the Tibetan Autonomous Region. So that's usually what people think of as Tibet. But then I've also covered, the Tibetan cultural regions within Sichuan and Gansu and Qinghai provinces. So I've been, to these areas a lot, over the last, I guess, 8 years. And I was not fortunate enough to really get there in the 90s, when you could just travel everywhere so freely. But I've been to most of the areas that you can get to now.
What was it about Tibet that drew you as an individual, as a traveler?
Well, I mean, I think as a traveler and a travel writer, it's just one of those destinations that, is magnetic. When you're growing up, you read probably Tintin might have been the first sort of exposure to Tibet that I had, and you just would read, these old guides, you'd read National Geographic's, accounts, in your dentist's office, you'd have this really old account from the 1930s of some explorer going there. You'd see on TV, Tibetan, the Dalai Lama, who's just, such a charismatic figure. And you just think, I want to go there. I want to go to this land, where, this man, this beautiful smiling man was the leader for such a long time. And just, I like mountains. I mean, I like, rugged terrain. I like hiking. And it was just a destination that just, like I said, just really drew me in.
As we get into this podcast, I guess the first question listeners might be asking is, why should I consider visiting Tibet, and why now specifically?
There are, I guess, a million reasons. Anyone who's just attracted to an old civilization, an old country, will find a lot of very, very sort of deep experiences there. Anyone who's interested, as I said, in landscapes that are kind of otherworldly almost, plants and animals that don't really exist in other parts of the world, this unique geology the Tibetan plateau really shapes all of Asia. I mean, the main rivers of Asia, like the Mekong, come from Tibet. They all come down from the mountains. So, and just the currents that create monsoons in Southeast Asia. I mean, all these things are affected by this massive plateau. Going there and seeing, the source, of these rivers and the sources of, just every, the life and the weather that shapes all of Asia. That's a fascinating experience. And then you have this culture, this very deep, religious culture. Majority of the men would have been monks, would have been living in monasteries. It was just a society where, religious practice was just, considered the norm. And even today, people consider it normal that you would walk 1,000 miles, for a pilgrimage, and some people will do this prostrating themselves the entire time. I mean, they wear on their knees, on their shins, on their hands, they wear special gloves and protectors, and they will literally go from Lhasa to Mount Kailash. And this is considered normal. This kind of pilgrimage, to holy places, is considered an activity that everybody wants to aspire to. So this is something that's, getting a little bit more rare in the world. This idea that the sort of the other world is the one that we aspire to, and not the material world and the money and and power and position. So it's an interesting place to go to see that. Of course, there's a lot. The society's in transition. There's a lot of influence from China now, and that of course can spoil that kind of effect for a lot of people. And so you need to kind of get out, away from sort of the tourist areas, or even just, within the tourist areas, just try to find a little sort of niche where that kind of old, atmosphere still exists.
So you mentioned deep experiences. Have you had a deep experience there in Tibet? Can you share something personal?
So when I went through Eastern Tibet, that was easier to do because, there weren't that many tourists. I think my wife and I went, and we were. Yeah, we were, and in those couple of weeks, we were the only foreigners, the only Westerners that were around. And one of the really beautiful things that we saw was at this lake, whose name escapes me at the moment, but it's a very holy lake in Eastern Tibet, and there's a special tree where the leaves have these sort of veins on them that they believe, the locals believe, form all the animals of the zodiac. So, and they believe that, these are not just symbols to them. These are actually manifestations, of different gods and different, creatures from the spirit world. And so that's one of the things that was interesting to really see that, that sort of belief that these things are not just symbols. It's not just like you have an image. It's like, when they look at the statue of a Buddha, that's actually the Buddha that they believe that they're seeing. It's like, there's the essence of the Buddha is within that statue. So this plant, it was just amazing. Like all you could really see was sort of the snake. So of course they're just, these sort of Naga images, but they say that other times of the year you will see, shapes of other animals on these little leaves, and just, that's just that understanding was really quite profound, that everything that they see when they see a mountain, they're seeing the Buddha within that mountain. They're seeing having religious experiences with every part of their landscape. I was at the Baka Monastery, which is it's beautiful sort of shelf above the Parlong Sampo River, and the head monk was just explaining this mountain that came down and it formed like an elephant. And this time it actually really looked like an elephant. There's a lot of these shapes that, you're like,
I don't quite see it.
I don't quite see it. Yeah. But this one was, and, it sort of tapered down into the trunk of the elephant. And he was like, this is, the Shakyamuni Buddha. And I said, it wasn't just, this is a painting or a symbol of him. This was like part of, this mountain actually had part of the essence of it.
In our Western world, sometimes we can be a bit disconnected from nature, not really taking things in. I think like what you're describing is really, almost forces you to pay attention to everything around you in terms of the natural world. Is that something that's pretty unique to Tibet?
Well, I wouldn't say it's unique because it's kind of a shamanistic tradition. Tibetan history, there was what they call like the Bun religion, like BON, and that was sort of the pre-Buddhist religion, and it was very sort of shamanistic. The belief, the humans basically can interact with the natural world and the spirit world and the physical world are basically just one sort of. Are connected through this sort of veil, and you can enter back and forth. One thing that's sort of unique about Tibet is the Buddhism there. It's a blend of, like I said, these sort of wild shamanistic traditions and formal Buddhism. So you have people worshiping trees and spirits, and rocks, and also these statues of the Buddha. So it's a very intellectual and a very sort of ancient kind of faith at the same time. And that's what I think has really always sort of drawn people, was that there's this immense imagination to the culture. And I'll give you just one example. They have these things called termas, which are these what they call treasure texts, and these things are these texts that apparently people in the past, whether one of the old, Indian gurus who came to Tibet or whether it was the first king of Tibet, they would have written these things in their lifetime and then buried them. And then at some point in the future, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years later, somebody who's usually a manifestation of that same person then finds the treasure because he needs that wisdom at that moment. And he goes and and it's like this kind of, reverse time travel, and so this is just one of the examples of, when you hear these stories, when you learn about these things, it's like, wow, you can really see why it's captured people's, the Western world, the Indian world, why it's captured people's imagination for so long.
I mean, that's something I definitely want to learn a little bit more about from you is how we as travelers can have a better chance of having these types of interactions on the ground with locals. But first, I think we should talk about this complex history with China. If you want to share a little bit around that and what's happening today.
Around the 6th century, 7th century, Tibet began to sort of form powerful kingdoms. And then Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century was the first, you could call him like the emperor, unified Tibet. And then he started to expand outward. And he actually conquered a lot of areas in China. And, he forced the Chinese to send him a bride, kind of a tribute, and first the Chinese were not, they believed they were the superior civilization. They did not want to do this. So, Songtsen Gampo invaded, parts of Western China and essentially forced their hand. So they sent this bride. She was kind of a minor member of the the Chinese royalty. And they sent her there, as kind of a war tribute, essentially. And if you want to just listen now to, Professor Cameron, who I interviewed in one of my podcasts, he'll basically explain this little bit of history of Princess Wencheng. And what's really important is how the Chinese and the Tibetans both have very, very different ideas about what she did. Because everybody credits her with bringing Buddhism to Tibet. Tibet was not a Buddhist place before she came along. So she brought what they call her part of her dowry was to bring the Jo Shakyamuni statue, which was, they say it's the likeness of the Buddha himself because the statue was made in the Buddha's lifetime. So it's, incredibly valuable statue. And she brought it from China as part of her dowry, along with, medicine, along with like basically doctors and philosophers and scientists and architects and everything, to essentially bring Chinese, civilization and science to Tibet. Now, the question, of course, is, did China send her there, or did Tibet, the Tibetan emperor ask her to come here in order to, civilize his people? So that's where sort of the propaganda comes in, because you have, the Chinese saying, oh, we've been, benevolently sending, expertise to Tibet for, 1,500 years. And that's why Tibet is considered part of China. Whereas Tibetans will say, well, no, she actually was, somebody that we wanted her to come here because we wanted to sort of improve our living standards, so to speak. So Professor Warner will just kind of give this sort of an overview of this sort of propaganda battle.
So now we're going to share a clip from Robert's podcast from this interview he did, his podcast Travel Tape, and here it is.
Wencheng Gongzhu, her name in Chinese, was a probably minor member of the imperial family. And so she's sent to Tibet middle of the 7th century, probably around 639 AD, and for the purposes of marrying this particular Tibetan king named Sonsun Gampo. And when she gets to Tibet, then she marries the king, and the king of Tibet, he kind of creates a big empire, basically. He becomes the first emperor, and he has a number of different foreign brides, and she is his Chinese foreign bride. Beginning somewhere around probably the 11th, 12th century, so hundreds and hundreds of years after she's made this trip, the Buddhist authors in Tibet start writing this history as being this great story of how Tibet converted to Buddhism and that she was an important missionary. And what did she do to convert the country? She brought with her a statue of the Buddha. By the 12th century, Tibetans recognized it as being the most important Buddha statue that they had. And that's called the Jo Shakyamuni. So imagine a place in Tibet, they probably had at some point millions of Buddha statues. They elevated this one as the most important one, and this is the woman who brought it. From the Chinese point of view, the main story is that Tibet was this really kind of backward, undeveloped place. It was outside of civilization. It was in the hinterlands. It wasn't part of the empire. And Tibetans were these barbarians who were harassing their borders, like a lot of barbarians did. In order to placate the barbarians, they sent someone to marry one of their kings. Later, Chinese historians then start talking about, well, what did she do when she got there? And they say, she brought books about medicine, books about architecture, books about farming. And so by the time you get to the 20th century, they start this narrative that the history of Tibet being dependent upon China for material development goes way back to sending this princess. And that basically, from the very beginnings of Tibetans and Chinese meeting each other, the Chinese have been benevolently sending people out to this hinterland region with development expertise.
So now, just to continue sort of beyond that, because that, we arrive at about the 11th century, and then the relationship between China and Tibet has been, sort of on and off again since then. One of the monasteries we might talk about is like the Sakya monastery, which had this relationship with Genghis Khan and then the Mongols when they invaded China, and they had this what they call like a priest-patron relationship where the Mongols essentially converted, at least the Mongol sort of aristocracy converted to Buddhism, and in exchange they sort of offered this protection. So Tibet was, it was autonomous in the sense that the lamas could rule the country, but they were under the protection. Now, of course, the Tibetans will say, yes, but the Mongols were not Chinese. They were basically an invading army. So if you look at the history, it's like India saying, well, the British controlled India and Burma and Malaysia, so therefore India can claim Burma as its territory, because we were all once controlled by this large empire. So that's sort of like why this battle is constantly going on. Whereas the Chinese will say, well, no, this was always a Chinese, civilization, always a Chinese government, whether it was the Mongols or later on the Manchus and so on. And so, you have this long history where Tibet sometimes was completely autonomous. Because there was no, the Chinese empire was weak. They exerted no control at all over Tibet. And there are other times where, perhaps like an invading, Tibetan dynasty had some influence over. And then, of course, that brings us up to the 20th century where in 1911, after the revolution, when, the last Chinese empire was dissolved, the Qing empire, and the Republican era began. There was the Chinese had no control over Tibet for about, almost 50 years. And Tibetans, looked upon that as an era, as how things should be. This is, whenever Chinese, are weak, basically, they have no control over us, which means, that we're not an integral part of their territory. And anyway, so that sort of brings us up to, the end of the 1950s when the communists took over. And as soon as the communists took over, they wanted, then when they kicked the nationalists out, they decided they wanted to move into Tibet. They wanted to claim this territory, this territory. They considered Tibet a part of, an integral part of Chinese history, sort of historical territory. So they invaded, eastern Tibet, and then, they had they were very battle hardened. They've been fighting a civil war. They've been fighting the Japanese. The Tibetans were disorganized, and they pretty much just moved in there and said, we will completely, invade the country if you don't agree, to our terms, which is essentially where Tibetans had to sign saying that, they were part of China. And that's been sort of the history since. There were CIA-funded skirmishes, in eastern Tibet in the Kham region, where the CIA, literally in Colorado, which is where you're from, they were training Tibetan guerrillas in the mountains, and they were sending them back, to try to basically, sort of foment rebellion. That failed. I mean, part of one of the problems it failed is that the Tibetans, we think of Tibet as there's sort of one people, one culture, one language, but it's a giant area, and there was always a lot of conflict within Tibet itself. So, that's one of the things I'd really like when people go to Tibet is that they, spend a little time looking at the history, find out where you're actually going, because every area you're going to go in is going to have quite a different history and probably even possibly a different language. I had this issue when I first went to Tibet. I was studying Tibetan for a few months, and when I went there, in Lhasa it was okay. I could communicate a little bit with people, and then when we went outside Lhasa and we were stopped, at this roadblock, and there was a nomad tent there, and so I went into the tent and I was trying to talk to the people there, and my guide just starts laughing, and I said, why are you laughing? He goes, they're nomads. He goes, they don't speak in this formal sort of Lhasa dialect.
They don't speak like those city folk.
Exactly. It's exactly like, and that's one thing I really love about Tibet is that, the more you kind of get into it, you see all these patterns, of like city versus country, central versus, the hinterlands. You see all these patterns that you get, in every country. You get that in America, people, we don't like the people on the East Coast. We don't like the people in the South. We don't, and everywhere is the same. Okay. So we sort of ended basically with the communists invading, Tibet signing this agreement, essentially, giving, they were promised a fair amount of autonomy, which is why it's called, the TAR, the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Part of the Chinese constitution was to give minority regions a fair amount of autonomy. The reality is that, no, they don't. Most of the policies are still, dictated from Beijing, but they maintain these names. So anyway, they gave them this, in exchange, okay, you have religious freedom. You'll still be able to, live, your traditional life the way you like, but, you must consider yourselves part of China. That didn't last very long, because the Chinese essentially got impatient with the Tibetans. He said, well, we've given you this opportunity to escape from your sort of feudal past, and to get rid of this religious superstition. You're not doing it. You're not doing it fast enough. So they started to, put a lot of pressure, and, a lot of persecution on the culture, and of course, the sort of the apex of that was during the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1966, where thousands and thousands of monasteries were razed. Monks were persecuted, jailed, killed, and it was this it was a horrific time. I mean, it was literally the destruction of an entire civilization that was happening. You had in the period after the Cultural Revolution, a lot of discussion within the CCP about, okay, why are these minorities so angry with us? What can we do? And there was, some attempts back and forth to kind of like allow religious freedom, which is sort of the situation we have today, where I guess at a low level, they have the ability to worship, to practice their practice Buddhism, but most of the spiritual leaders have been forced to flee the country because they'd be arrested, they'd be persecuted. Of course, the Dalai Lama is the most famous example of somebody who's fled. But there's when and if you go to Mount Everest, base camp, you'll hear stories, of, this is a route where a lot of people took, to flee into Nepal. The culture, I guess, at the grassroots, is still there, but, it's in a very advanced form of Buddhism. It's a very intellectual form of Buddhism. It requires, masters and pupils. And that's a lot of that has been destroyed. A lot of the monasteries now actually have, Chinese, like Chinese monks within them, is kind of, essentially kind of watching what's going on. When you go into Lhasa, to Sera and Drepung, you have cameras. You have cameras all around the monastery.
And they're just that sensitive to them practicing their traditions.
Yeah. Super, super sensitive about that. Within Tibet itself, there's still a great resistance to Chinese rule. If you go to Lhasa, at least half of Lhasa is Chinese now. If you go, you go outside of Lhasa, most of the restaurants, most of the hotels are run by Chinese as well. There's a huge amount of immigration. I mean, there've been riots in the 90s and the 2000s against this, because Tibetans felt that, not only has our land been invaded, but we're not even getting any benefit from this. There's the economy is booming. There's lots of opportunities here for business, but we're being sort of shut out. So there was that resentment, compounded by the general resentment of having your land invaded. And so 2007 was the last sort of big. Just before the Olympics, I guess, the year before the Olympics, just the last big riots. And that was when the Chinese just really cracked down afterwards. And now when you go, especially in Lhasa, it's really like an occupied territory. To get into any of the holy sites, you have X-ray machines, you have guards, you have to pass through security constantly to go through. So that's sort of the situation now. And the Chinese have made it very, very difficult for foreigners to enter Tibet.
Well, that's where I was going to go next, because as travelers, I think this is hugely important, like how we can actually visit the country. I know, at least from what I read, that you do have to be on these organized tours, and given your expertise, well, us as independent travelers, or even if you do enjoy the occasional tour, you want to make sure you're on a good one, right? Like, what are some of your top tips for visiting Tibet, getting the proper visas and permits, doing it the right way, but doing it in a way where you can still have an authentic experience? Yeah,
so looking at Sichuan, Gansu, and Qinghai province, essentially the provinces that skirt, eastern and northern Tibet. Within them, along the border regions, they are Tibetan. They've always been sort of part Tibetan. I mean, the current Dalai Lama comes from Qinghai. Okay, so that gives you an idea that these are significant areas, and so you have a lot more freedom, because you don't have to have a guide. You can take the local buses. You can get on a bus, with a group of Tibetan pilgrims, and you can go to the monastery, which is something that you pretty much can't do anymore within the the TAR. You can go hiking, like in Qinghai and Sichuan, you just can get out, wander off into the mountains. In Gansu, around like Shahe and Langmusu, lots and lots of day hikes, overnight hikes. You can arrange. There are Tibetans, groups there, like at Langmusu, which will take you horseback riding like for 2 or 3 days. When you're just visiting these really remote villages. Qinghai.
That sounds super nice.
It's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, like, you're going way out there. You're just visiting nomad camps. You're in just incredibly gorgeous mountains and scenery. And you're just following footpaths and horse paths. So that's a really serious option for people. Southern Qinghai is also the same. Wushu, which is probably getting a little bit more developed now because there's an airport. But when I first went there, it was 98% Tibetan, and I mean, so few foreigners went there. As soon as I got off the bus, I mean, people are just coming up and where are you from, and then more people come over because they see a crowd, and then more people come over because they see a bigger crowd, and suddenly you've got 100 people surrounding you.
Is travel in these more, I guess, I don't want to say remote areas, but are they remote or maybe less visited areas? Is there still, I guess, some infrastructure for, places to stay? And, is it a little bit cheaper to travel over there? What are some of the other things around that in terms of like the logistics?
Okay. Because of the way China has really expanded domestic tourism over the last, especially 5 years, most of these places you'll find, good hostel networks. You'll find, I guess, what you call like, mini buses often that you can rent, or taxis you can rent for a couple hours. So yeah, considerably cheaper, because of course you don't have the daily expense, that you have of a guide and driver in the TAR. So So they can be very cheap. You get out, you eat at local restaurants, and it's just, it's extremely inexpensive. Noodles and a little bit of, sheep or yak meat, whatever you like. And I said, and usually you'll find other travelers in these areas, to rent, a van for the day, to take you out to, a lot of the remote monasteries and temples, just to see the countryside, just to go for a hike, all these things. So yeah, I mean, they have, generally you can, in these areas you can get around easily, and yeah, they're definitely cheaper. The experience tends to be good because, like the people are just a little bit less wary, because they politically they have less repressions in these areas. I mean, a good example is like in sort of the Amdo, like the northeastern region. I mean, they can learn Tibetan at in high school, university. They have Tibetan classes. They have Tibetan TV stations. You have lectures on public TV. So there's the cultural life in many ways can be more richer because they don't have all this sort of surveillance and sort of guardianship of them.
What are the best times to visit Tibet? Which months?
Well, if you're going into the TAR, most anywhere from spring to say September. Lhasa, I haven't been there in winter, but a lot of people recommend it. You wouldn't want to go too far outside of Lhasa because of the snows and the problems. Early spring, a lot of people didn't want to go because out to the far west because rivers would flood and you had to still take ferries across. Whereas now, there's bridges across all the major rivers, so it's less of a concern than it used to be. The other regions, like in Qinghai. I mean, you don't want to go in Qinghai in winter. It's pretty miserable. Really, really, really cold, and I don't think very much happens. Sichuan, would be okay in the spring, right through the fall, because of course it's more sort of subtropical. So it would depend. Basically, it would depend on the region, but generally. Summer is going to be the busiest season, especially in Lhasa.
Do you find that there are a decent amount of people speaking English where you can have, I mean, I know you speak Mandarin, but many of us don't.
Right. No, your guide, I mean, if you're going into the TAR, you're with a guide and they all speak English. So basically they can usually act as interpreters. You'll get, within Lhasa, you'll meet some Tibetans who can speak English. But generally, yeah, you're not going to find, too many people. But, I mean, a lot of it's just, you're a traveler, a lot of it's just body language, you just see people and you're smiling and they're smiling and,
you
there's
can still have
those
those meaningful interactions.
Yeah, and there's just an exchange that happens, which, it's not so much about, clear information, but it's still an exchange of you to them and them to you. And that's sort of what happens a lot.
If you are visiting the TAR area or you want to see some of the main sites, do you have any tips on finding a good guide?
Unfortunately, no, because now I believe this year you actually don't even have a choice anymore. And I think they're kind of randomly assigned. So you don't. I mean, essentially, you're looking for a good agency that's Tibetan run, and you can look in Lonely Planet. You can look at TripAdvisor for people who give you advice about some of the better agencies. So look for an agency that is Tibetan run, because you do not want a Chinese guide. Because the Chinese guide will, of course, give you, the Chinese version of history, which, Professor Warner, kind of explained to us a little bit earlier. And that's not what you want. You don't go to, you wouldn't travel to France and have, like a German guide, telling you what he thinks of France, so essentially, yeah, unfortunately, that's part of where we are right now in the TAR is that the restrictions are getting, more and more. The Chinese are promising, that in a few years they'll lift them, they'll make it easier, but I wouldn't really hold my breath on that.
I got to ask you about trekking and some of the mountain activities, because I would imagine that many people visiting Tibet are going to want to do some hiking and walking in the mountains. And of course, you mentioned the famous Mount Kailash pilgrimage. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You are?
Where you circumnavigate that mountain, I believe.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
I know it's a very popular thing. It's something that's on many people's bucket lists. I mean, I'd have to say, that would be a very cool thing to do. Do you want to talk about what it's like arranging a trip like that on the ground and just share a little bit about your experience around trekking and how we as travelers can prepare, maybe a little bit about what we should bring, just any advice around trekking and hiking in Tibet.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. It's actually quite easy. I mean, to do. There's no problem for foreigners to go there and trek, as long as you have your guide with you, and as long as you get the permits. So if you want to do Mount Kailash, which, I mean, I recommend it. I've done it twice, and you tell your agency, when you're going to Tibet, that this is something you want to do. So you have, depending on your time, because it's a 3-day Kora. The Kora is essentially the circumambulation around the mountain, and you need a few days to get there, at least a few days. And the reason you need a few days is, one, because of course the distance, but also because you've got to acclimatize yourself to the altitude. You're going to get up to, I think it's 5,600 meters at the highest point, and you're going to start at 4,700 meters. So if you're not accustomed to the altitude, you'll have serious problems. It's a popular mountain with Indian pilgrims, and every summer a few of them die. So you got to take it seriously. These are hard, high, rough places. So tell your agency you want to, this is what you want to do, and then you have the choice of taking the southern route or the northern route. The southern route now, because it's paved the whole way, you can do it. You can get there in a couple of days, and it's much cheaper. One, because of the time, and two, because you don't need to take a 4-wheel drive vehicle because it's a paved road. You can just, you can get in a van. So, if you're looking to do this and, you don't have as much time, you don't have as much money, you take the southern route. Essentially, you tell the agency the things you want to bring. You want to bring, a good sleeping bag, minus 20 degree sleeping bag, because it's, no matter what time of the year, it's going to get cold. You don't need wet weather, any kind of like wet weather gear, because it's going to be dry. It might snow, and it actually did snow on us one time, and we were basically up to our waist, in snow, and it was really scary, because you're trying to, you're basically in a blizzard, and you're just following, the yaks. They send the yaks out, and we're, listening to the sounds of the yaks and trying to find our way back. So, you want to have gear that keeps you really warm. So, you're going to have layers. You're going to have a thermal layer at the bottom. You're going to have some kind of, you're going to have Gore-Tex, which is, obviously waterproof, and, just because that's what most equipment is. So you want to have, pants, like probably Gore-Tex pants, Gore-Tex jacket, good hood, like I said, thermals, several layers. I'm going to give you an example. I was in a snowstorm, on Mount Kailash, and I was perfectly warm. I had, good thermal layer on. I had, what else? I think I had kind of normal trekking pants, and then a Gore-Tex pants over that, good socks, boots. I had, thermal layer, under layer, and then I think a shirt, and then a sweater, and then a fleece jacket, and then the Gore-Tex jacket, so, 3 or 4 layers, hat, all that kind of stuff. And, I was in a snowstorm and not cold. So there's a good idea of what the type of stuff you want to be prepared with. You'll see people there, like literally, especially the Chinese travelers, you'll see them in jeans. We actually, at the monastery, after the first day, we had to leave this Chinese group behind. I don't know when they got out of there. They must have been stuck there for days, because they were there in like t-shirts, little sort of plastic jackets, and jeans and sneakers, and they had a snowstorm,
Yeah.
And so it's crazy. So don't look at what other people
clueless.
are. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's unbelievable. So would you recommend the northern route if you have the time?
Oh yeah. The northern route goes along with called like the Changtang Plateau, and it's just like this otherworldly landscape. This every picture you take, because the air is so crisp and the colors are so vibrant, and the shapes are just so, kind of like, simple, just plain, and then mountains, and then these, Himalayan peaks, snow-covered peaks in the distance, and then deserts, and, and then you get these salt lakes, sort of with the reflections of all the mountains in them. Just absolutely like stellar landscape. It's hard because you have to be in a 4-wheel drive for like a week. The towns are horrible. Really like hotels that just lock their bathrooms, and you have to go outside.
Yeah.
because there's no water in
some
the town.
hard traveling.
It's some hard traveling, but the rewards are just, like I said, this gorgeous landscape. And I mean, you'll come across places where the mountains are just purple and green, and pink because of there's no vegetation on them, and the mineral deposits are just sticking right out of them, right? So I mean, absolutely worthwhile doing that route. And then there's a few cool things, like there's some areas of petroglyphs and what they call like the Gugye Kingdom, which is this old, I guess over the 11th, 12th century, Tibet had this kind of revival. It kind of died. It didn't die out, but it was persecuted for a while in its history. And then had this big revival in the 11th century, and one of the centers was in Western Tibet in the Gugye Kingdom, and you have the remains there, especially like the like the Tholing Monastery, and then they call it like the Gugye Kingdom itself, which is this incredible sort of rock outcrop where all these tunnels and caverns and buildings were just carved right into it. And you just look over, I think it's like the Sutlej River Valley, which, most of the time is dry. And so, of course, you get all these incredible formations formed, when the river, when the river drops, and then the wind just, whips around the valley and creates, this landscape with the limestone and the sand. So you'll be passing through it, and you'll just keep seeing like, castles. You'll see, you'll look up on the cliff walls, and you'll see pillars, and these things are not real. These things have just been sort of carved out by the wind, right? And the rain. But you think and every time you go back, you see different things. And like I said, you think you're just in this magical world because these barren cliffs are just, like I said, they look like castles and facades from palaces, and it's an unbelievable landscape.
Any trip there would be lacking if you didn't visit monasteries, right? Do you want to share a little bit about the experience at the monasteries? Maybe you can tell us, what we would see as travelers, but then a little bit behind the curtain, what actually might be going on with some of the rituals and the chanting there.
Okay. Yeah, you're obviously going to Tibet. You're going to visit monasteries. In the more remote areas, you could be the only person there, and there could just be one monk, who's kind of the caretaker. And a lot of those are quite interesting because you can, through your guide, you can kind of ask them, okay, what is the history of this place? Perhaps at one point, was a very vibrant center, of worship or of study. A lot of these, I came across one monastery once, wasn't in Lonely Planet, wasn't in any guidebook. And I just found it because this taxi driver said, hey, you want to go to this really interesting place? And, kind of thinking like, oh man, this could be really good or really awful.
Yeah. That's always the question with the taxi drivers, right?
But I mean, it was he and his wife, and I had a good feeling about this. So they took me to this monastery, which was it's used to be one of the the major centers for the sort of the Gelugpa order, which is the main within Tibetan history. You had different monastic orders which had sort of ascended to power at different points. This monastery turned out to be one of the sort of the great 5 or 10 great former monasteries of this order. And you could see it was all like these chapels and temples built in the side of the hill. Most of them were empty. They were slowly sort of being restored. But this had been a center of of medical studies. And the monk basically just sort of took me around and just kind of explained like this is where they did astrological studies. This is where they did medical studies. I mean, stuff that, it's just absolutely, fascinating as a traveler. You're just, you can just feel the history and, sort of flowing through the area, when this person talks. And so, you never know what you're actually going to, to discover. Okay, so what you just heard is chanting and music, and religious music from two of the big monasteries in Lhasa. But these musical instruments, will be played around Tibet. So generally, you have drums, you have like miniature drums, you have trumpets and oboes. You actually have like conch shells as well. And so, it's basically cymbals and percussion, and it creates this, sort of eerie, repetitive kind of sound, that's very sort of, has, kind of an inherent kind of spiritual feeling to it, but also a very kind of sort of, sensual sound to it. And this is something that, one of the things that, these monasteries, in Tibet, when you enter them, you enter from the outside, from this harsh, windy, barren kind of land, Tibetan, plateau landscape. And then you go through, you pull back, these sort of yak hair, kind of curtains, and you're in this world where suddenly like your nose is filled with like this smell of, yak, butter, yak butter burning, and there's flickering lights, and there's usually like, holes in the roof and the sides where, shafts of sunlight are coming through, and there's these colors, like all these hanging umbrellas, and there's the carpets, that are on all the, the sort of prayer mats, and then these gold statues everywhere, and paintings, these incredibly, like elaborate, like tankas that hang on the walls. So it's just this overload, on your senses, which is, and especially coming from the outside world, which is, just so hard on the senses. And then you come into this like, soft, like sensuous, religious sort of world. It's just an incredible experience when you go into the, a temple where, there's a lot of monks in there, and there's chanting, and the atmosphere is really kind of like, alive at that moment. I mean, it's just, incredibly powerful. You just see, again, why this religion captured, the imagination of, sort of nomadic people living on the plains, because, you're going into a holy place, but it's a holy place that's really designed to hit the senses. You have these, and you go to the protector chapel, and they have these demons, like, and sometimes stuffed, like wolves, and other wild animals, on the walls. And I mean, and, they're meant to, be terrifying, because they're literally meant to protect the temple from evil forces. So, just, get into that. I mean, like, don't just, look at them and go, oh, look at those interesting, things on the wall. Like, just, to try to feel like, wow, why would he have like a wolf on the wall? Why would you have, this demon, like with, spikes through his mouth, and, all sort of black and crazy looking and crazy hair? Why would you have that? And obviously it's meant to impress you, to impress, the demons, right? So you want to feel that, and the music, you want to feel like the rhythmic, soothing sort of chanting, that's there. And so I guess my advice would be just, it's meant to make you feel something. And so, try to kind of like let go of, I guess, let go of kind of an observational mind, and just try to get more into sort of an experiential kind of feeling. Like I'm here to experience something. I'm here to, take in all of these sights and sounds, because that's what this temple is designed to do.
Do you have you want to share a little bit about where people can find you, and where they can learn more about you and your writing and everything else?
So yeah, people want to know more about what I'm doing, they can go, first of all, you go to my website, robertscottkelly.com. That's where I talk about, the articles I've written, where I share books I've worked on, pictures, that kind of thing. Also my podcast, traveltapethepodcast.com. One of my last episodes was about a journey to Eastern Tibet. So, you can basically listen to that, get a sense of, some of the things we talked about earlier, just, how everywhere in the world, is local, and that's, yeah. And, whatever, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, all that kind of stuff, but, I'm not gonna promote that. So.
If you want more around destinations, I know, Robert's doing a lot of work putting together his podcast over there, Travel Tape. So you can check that out.
Anybody wants to ever write, ask me questions. I mean, I'm always happy, to, give people advice about itineraries, about places they're going to. You can write me about, Tibet, China, Taiwan, places, like that I'm in, or Malaysia now where I'm living, places that I'm very familiar with. I'm always happy to give people answers, to these places.
You are a guidebook writer, as I mentioned, or you have worked on guidebooks for Lonely Planet. I had a couple questions around that, because this always sounds like one of those, dream jobs, but I wanted to get the real story, I guess. It also seems like a lot of work. What has been your experience as a guidebook writer?
Well, I mean, every country, is different, depending on how much you have to cover, how much already, exists in the guidebook that's been well researched. So if you get a place, that hasn't been covered very well, and you've got to, go there and find out a lot of the history and the culture, to kind of bring it out, to bring it out more, for the readers, then it's a tremendous amount of work. A place like Tibet is kind of a challenge because you're spending a lot of your day just, in a car, just driving, but you can't really tell people what you're doing. So you're having sort of secret ways, to kind of gather information. Cell phones have been absolutely brilliant because, you can just take out your cell phone, click on, the record, and just talk to yourself. Nobody's, not even a, Chinese police officer is going to, question, the fact that you're just talking into a cell phone. You can take notes. You can pretend, that you're just texting somebody, and you can, but you can actually be literally like writing down hotel prices, and restaurant prices and things like that, which, was much harder, before that because you'd have to, write it down with a pen and paper. So you'd have to memorize these things until you could kind of get around a corner, and then write them down. So, that every sort of country is different. Tibet is also hard because, just physically, the altitude, is hard. If you get sick, you still have to work because you're on an itinerary, and you're just basically, dying, but you arrive in some little town and you're, it's like really late and like, I still need to check out the restaurants here. I still need to, check out the, the hotels and see what they're like. There are places like where, we would stop for lunch and I would just tell my guide, I'm just going to walk around this village, for a few minutes. And I would just leave the restaurant and I'd go run into all these different restaurants and hotels, guest houses, checking out the prices.
Yeah.
and then sneak back, to the before they, got suspicious. But there's Alaska. I did Alaska. That was an absolute dream job. You basically have enough of a budget. You can rent a car and you drive down, the Alaska highway. You drive down, these different highways, Denali National Park, camp. I'm being paid to camp in Denali National Park.
Right.
It's kind of a dream job.
What's your best advice for aspiring travel writers to get into something like this? If you have like a short bit of wisdom.
Basically now I would be, focusing on starting a blog or something that you can get Lonely Planet's attention because they work with bloggers now. They have, I forget the name of the program that they do, but, essentially they start out, you get accepted into the program and then you kind of build your way up to where, they actually might start asking you to write articles for them. And then you can start, sort of pitching, for different destinations. So, essentially becoming an expert on a destination, showing them that, you've got something published, whether, whether it's, on your blog, whether it's, some kind of publication that, official media publication, all these things, sort of count in your favor. And a lot of it's just kind of luck, when I first started, my first work was in Taiwan, and it was because they didn't want to work with a previous author who, they just decided they wanted somebody fresh. They wanted a new, and, I just was sort of around at the time and I'd been writing and, already for a long time. And so, everything was kind of ready. So when the opportunity came, I had, my resume to show them, and, the expertise of that destination. So, it's kind of like what they say, like when opportunity comes, you have to have, prepared yourself. You can't prepare yourself when that opportunity arrives because it's too late. They're going to, any company or any, organization is going to go with somebody, who's got already, writing experience or whatever experience, they're looking for, and happens to be on the spot. Right.
Last question. Have you ever seen a snow lion or a Yeti?
No, I have not. I'd like to say maybe, but no. I mean, in BC, I'm from British Columbia, the home of Sasquatch, so I'm kind of primed, for these kind of myths, I was looking for them, but no, unfortunately,
Not going to be a Bigfoot guidebook in your future Bigfoot sightings, best top locations around the world for Bigfoot sightings.
That's my next article, top 10 Bigfoot sightings.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time today. Thanks for sharing all of your advice around Tibet as a destination. And I just want to say thanks so much. And
I'd like to return that. Thank you so much for having me on.
Cool. It was a pleasure. Take care.
All right, you too.
There you have it. Want to thank our guest today, Robert Kelly, for stopping by the show. And I want to leave you with a quote from none other than the Dalai Lama, who said, "The purpose of our lives is to be happy." I'll end on that note. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by ZeroToTravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.